Good afternoon, and welcome to this session of FPRI Asia Program series of events. Today we're going to be talking about the recent incidents in the Taiwan Strait, the escalation of Chinese military flights in the area, and what it all means. I'm delighted to welcome for our conversation today Gerald C. Brown, who is the Defense Analyst in Washington, D.C. He works on nuclear deterrence, the People's Liberation Army, and most topically today, Cross-Strait security. If you've been following the issue of the Chinese flights and military actions in the Taiwan area in recent days, you will have seen him quoted in the Washington Post, New York Times, and elsewhere. I'm Jacques deLisle. I'm Director of the Asia Program here at FPRI, and I thank you for joining us today. I hope you'll enjoy today's programs, and that if you do, you'll consider joining us by going to fpri.org. Gerald, let's begin with, I guess, the trigger for our recent concerns, which is in October 1st, China's National Day, and the days that followed, we've seen a significant uptick in Chinese military aircraft flying near Taiwan, and we've all been hearing about the escalation in tensions and cross-strait conflict or potential conflict. So what's been happening? How would you characterize what's been going on? And in what way does it differ from what we've seen before? Because after all, this is hardly the first time China sent planes in that airspace. Indeed, the pace had been an average of one a day for a year or so preceding the recent events.
Yeah, Jack, and thanks for having me on. That's absolutely right. So the real shift with October 1st to October 4th, we saw just a massive uptick in the pure scale of the number of flights entering Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Over those 4 days, there were 149 different sorties being flown into that. And preceding that, the highest number for an entire month was 117 over that entire span. So definitely a large kind of a quantitative increase in the ratio of flights being sent into there.
And so has there been any change in the composition of what's been sent in there? It had been fighter jets, the occasional bomber. Is there anything new going on other than the increase in frequency?
I don't really know that there's a massive change in the composition. So there were a lot more fighter jets being sent through, like J-16s, things along like Strikers, things along those lines. But typically when we've seen the large incursions, because larger incursions of around 20 or so have happened in the past, especially over the past year since the Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense started releasing the data. But we've seen whenever they've had a large incursion, it's typically featured a lot more fighters. So that's kind of on track for a large increase in the incursions. There were definitely a lot more bombers, things along those lines, but it's also kind of hard to attribute how much of that is a change of composition versus a change of scale, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. So, Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense has described this as the worst moment in 40 years for this kind of conflict. And you've seen some rather loose talk about Chinese planes going into Taiwanese airspace. Now, for our viewers here, this is kind of a complicated airspace landscape. So we have the Air Defense Identification Zone, which is where these flights have been occurring. Taiwan declares, like many countries, an ADIZ, as it's known in the trade, where approaching aircraft are supposed to give notice. Then we've got the median line in the strait, the halfway point between the mainland and Taiwan. And then we've got the 12 nautical miles of airspace that sits above the territorial sea. So tell us where these planes have been operating and what the significance is of being in those various spaces.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a important distinction to make here between ADIZs and general ADIZs. What a word. They get complicated, right? They overlap in a lot of ways. For instance, China went over and established an ADIZ in the East China Sea in 2013 that overlaps with Japan, Korea, and Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. And the norms surrounding ADIZs aren't really well established. So for instance, the US goes over and maintains that it doesn't need to call into ADIZs, including people calling into its own ADIZ, unless they are planning on entering the country. Taiwan and other states disagree. There's a lot of different interpretations, and there's no real set of norms or laws or guidance governing this. The Chicago Convention went over and established that ADIZs were a thing, but it didn't really give any further guidance past that, right? So there's a lot of kind of tenuous distinctions here. When we're speaking about the incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, it's very specifically discussing either incursions across the median line, which that dividing point that you mentioned there, The incursions that we saw through early October did not cross this median line. They were instead in the southwest airspace of airspace. I apologize. The southwest region of Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So those are areas still a ways away from Taiwan's airspace, even though they did approach it not necessarily super close, but as they went on the southeast corner, which we kind of saw there, and we can go over and provide some of the kind of flight maps or whatever as well. They were really concentrated in this region, which is where we've seen most of the increases over the past 3 years.
Right, and so the median line is a sort of thing which under ordinary circumstances between two states would be a maritime boundary, and each side would say that it had some degree of rights on either side. Now, it's more than the 12 nautical miles, it's more than 24 nautical miles across that strait there, but it would be the way we'd sort out various kinds of maritime rights. Of course, the funky thing about the Taiwan Strait is it's an international strait, so there's supposed to be freedom of navigation and overflight through it. Indeed, that's why the U.S. Is authorized legally to send ships through the strait, naval ships through the strait if it so chooses. But there has been, I take it, and you watch these things very closely, you've been keeping tabs on these flights. I take it that China has generally not done much of crossing the median line. If they did, it wouldn't have legal significance, but it would kind of be upsetting a de facto arrangement of some degree of tolerance for that Taiwanese claim on that side, although we've seen the occasional straying across the median line. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So there weren't really any median line crossings until in 1999, is when the PLA decided to cross over that again. And then after that, I don't believe, to the best of my knowledge, there was nothing until around March of 2019. So there was definitely a large shift in behavior. And I think that kind of is an interesting piece when you look at the ADIZ violations in general throughout the last couple of decades, because that's where we really see the interesting trends occur. Late 90s, the PLA really didn't fly into the Taiwan Strait at all. It mostly focused within its own sovereign airspace at 12 nautical miles off of China's coastline. And when around late 90, I believe 96 was when they went over and started to go into the Taiwan Strait more, but still west of the median line. And so if you go over and you look at a lot of like Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense reports, then they have numbers of PLA sorties going into its air defense identification zone, but west of the median line. And then around 2019, that started to shift again with the flights across the center line there, and increases quantitatively from that period where it's not necessarily flights west of the median line as the 99 to 2019 period were, but instead flights past the median line in a couple of rare circumstances and flights into the southwest portion of the air defense identification zone, which did not occur until that 2019 timeframe. And around 2019, we saw around 10 to 20, there's not like, they don't give the specific numbers until September 2020, they start actually releasing the reports, but there were around 10 flights in this region around 2019, around 380 in 2020, and we're at well over 600 for this year currently.
Great. And so I do want to say to our participants in the webinar here today, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A function, not the chat function, and we'll weave those in as we go along at appropriate points. And at the end, we'll also have some time for any additional questions we haven't gotten to at that point. So I want to take a step back from the recent developments to talk a bit about the backstory here, why China is doing what it's doing now. And as you say, it's not entirely new, but it's a quantitative uptick. So there's a long backstory here, which of course is that China claims sovereignty over Taiwan. It claims that Taiwan was inappropriately taken from China by virtue of one of those, in the Chinese view, illegal unequal treaties in the end of the 19th century when it was ceded to Japan. And then it remained under separate control after World War II as what China views as a legacy of an unfinished civil war. That is, that when the nationalists, the Republic of China government, retreated to Taiwan, it was just this remnant of a civil war that should eventually be resolved by bringing the territory back under Chinese control. So that's a very deep story. And then there's a more recent story where China, Beijing, has been quite upset with Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan from the Democratic Progressive Party, which China likes to brand as a separatist or independence party. And so there's been a real chill in cross-strait relationships for the 5 years or so that she's been in power. And then we have the Xi Jinping part of the story, who many view as seeing the recovery of Taiwan as something of a legacy issue, kind of like the recovery of Hong Kong was an accomplishment by his predecessor, Deng Xiaoping. And China has always insisted its preference is for peaceful unification, but has never ruled out the use of force, and has in the last couple of years kind of redoubled its insistence on the one country, two systems model as the model for unifying Taiwan. One first tried out in Hong Kong in a way that's not so popular in Taiwan. But we do have this sort of uptick in the tone of the rhetoric, if not the content of the policies, since early 2019 by Xi Jinping. Although the National Day speech, in a way, was a bit of a climb down. So what do you see as motivating what China's doing here? Is it Xi Jinping and politics and nationalism and so on that we've seen building up? Is he playing to domestic audiences? Or does this reflect his sense that the military balance is shifting steadily and now maybe reaching a tipping point across the strait where China can be more assertive because it has the military credibility that it's presumably trying to underscore with some of these maneuvers near?
I think, Jack, we could probably spend an hour talking about any one of those topics you just went into. So I think it's a little bit all of it, right? The narrative has definitely changed, especially with the election of Tsai Ing-wen in 2016, as you mentioned. But I think there is increasing understanding within the Communist Party and the PRC in general that Taiwan is unlikely or definitively never going to go over and accept China's desires in this realm. Unification seems increasingly less likely. Current polls state that 1% of Taiwanese support immediate unification. That number has been declining further and further year by year. The one country, two systems model was kind of devastated with the travesty in Hong Kong, and this is putting a lot more pressure on the PRC to use other measures. So obviously the PRC has never renounced the use of force and maintains that as a credible option for occupying Taiwan if peaceful means are exhausted, and it's increasingly seeming like these peaceful means may be exactly that. Which raises a lot of concerns about the potential use of force, especially when you're looking at this in coordination with PLA modernization over the last 2 decades here. So towards your latter points there, it's really kind of a combination of all this, right? There's a large domestic signaling. Obviously, over the last couple of days here, the incursions that we saw were occurring during the PRC's National Day. So there was definitely this large kind of domestic nationalist signaling aspect here, but there's a lot of other reasons why we can go over and see upticks and why these flights occur in general. So there's a signaling component oftentimes. For instance, when Azar visited Taiwan in 2020, the PLA sent a large number of sorties across the center line. There's been certain actions that the United States or other countries have done where the PRC has reacted with sending large numbers of sorties as kind of a signaling mechanism. But more often than signaling, there's a lot more operational reasons. So this produces substantial wear on Taiwan's Air Force, which is obviously far smaller than the PLA Air Force. There's intelligence gathering operations going on here, pilot training. So something Bonnie Glaser pointed out is this is coming right at the end of the PLA Air Force's training period as well. So there's a lot of kind of different roles there. And I think that the increase that we see in the number of these sorties largely also displays an increase in confidence and the growing capabilities of the PLA.
All right, so just to pull together a few of the strands that have been the last part of our conversation, part of this is a China confidence story. That is the sense that the military balance is shifting in its favor. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, I expect there's perhaps some Chinese view that the U.S. is not ready to ride to the rescue in the context of certain cross-strait crises. Then there's a China lack of confidence story that says they're worried that Taiwan is slipping away, that peaceful unification is not going to happen. As you say, the one country, two systems model was never popular in Taiwan, and whatever popularity it might have enjoyed pretty much cratered with the Hong Kong developments in 2019, and now even more so with the national security law that's been implemented in Hong Kong since then. And then there's this operational aspect. China is not just intimidating with these measures, it's building or testing the capacity to perform some of the military actions that would be necessary if they wanted to either to invade or even just to coerce Taiwan. And in that vein, we've got a question in the chat that I want to get to, where our viewer asks, do you think ADIZ incursions can serve as a future indication for an impending PLA invasion of Taiwan? Because these intrusions have become almost daily in recent years, how do we gauge the seriousness of any of these events? Basically, how do we disentangle the things which are mere show versus those that are real threats? And does the mere show at some point become a reason to be more concerned about an imminent invasion? As you well know, we've seen comments from the head of Indo-PACOM, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, saying that we may be 5 or 6 years away from China being in a position to take serious military action. The Taiwan Minister of National Defense had a similar timetable, roughly 5 years. So where do you put this, and when should we start worrying, in other words, more than you have expressed worry about these maneuvers portending something more kinetic?
Yeah, no, and that's an excellent question. I don't think the ADIZ incursions on their own are a concern of immediate invasion or anything along those lines, right? I think the risk of an aircraft diverting from the ADIZ and going just by itself, the ADIZ incursions are not necessarily the threat. I think they're more likely symptomatic of the larger threat of PLA modernization and increasing unsatisfaction with the status quo at large. So larger concerns are the increasing PLA Navy, which is moving at breakneck speeds, Chinese integrated air defense systems, increasing in ballistic missiles, and just kind of the larger picture of the changing status quo. If we were to go over and see an actual move to take Taiwan in any manner, I think that would take a much larger buildup naturally and would be much more observable, if that makes sense. Now, as far as going over in timeframes of like when the PLA can go over and engage in something along those lines, that's really hard to say, right? Obviously, you pointed out Admiral Davison's 5-year and then 5-year kind of quote there, and that seems entirely possible. The kind of one of the points here too, though, is it may not necessarily be when we think is like when they are capable of doing that, or they could even be potentially capable of doing it in an earlier time frame, or even if not, like the states don't always make perfectly rational calculations on something along those lines, right? So it's really hard to say. I think that a more important thing is making sure that they don't have the capacity to do it easily, and that you can go over and deter them from engaging in those actions ever, if any of that makes sense.
I think so. The next topic I want to turn to, we've got a couple of questions in the chat about this as well. Is we've done this sort of why. The question we've touched upon a little bit, but I want to probe a little more now is the why now. We've touched upon that, some Chinese National Day obviously being an occasion for something of a focal point here. But there are a couple of other explanations that have been pointed to, one of which comes from one of our questioners, whether this is a sign of a possible power struggle in China, basically Xi seeking to make sure the PLA is still on his side, putting them front and center, giving them toys, giving them a mission. And this is always a concern for Chinese leaders, but if Xi is barely a year away from breaking the term limits and consolidating further power around himself, is that a possible motive? I'll throw that one out. And another one is whether the event that has been disclosed since the increase in ADIZ incursions, but that China probably knew about beforehand, which is the stationing of U.S. Special Operations Forces and trainers to basically beef up the capacity of the Taiwanese military. Either of those strike you as or any of those strike you as helpful explanations for why we've seen the uptick now?
I think you can go over and probably make a case for any of it, right? The challenge of this is it's very speculative in nature, right? And that's going to be with a lot of this. We don't have a clear statement from the PRC saying, hey, we are sending X planes into your air defense identification zone because of Y. So with, obviously you pointed out Xi Jinping's kind of like consolidating the national support and showing strength leading into the potential for him to go over and be in office for another 5 years. I think that would be quite a likely contender for a potential reason why this could be occurring. I find the special operations forces operating within Taiwan less likely. There were reports I mean, China would have probably known about this for a while, realistically. And there were reports as far back as a year ago saying that these forces were operating in Taiwan. The change was the confirmation. But I would have expected something more triggered towards that to go over and be more geared towards after said confirmation, right? And we haven't really seen any ADIZ uptick. I mean, knock on wood, since the October 1st through 4th. The timeframes don't necessarily match up, and ADIZ incursions were going on for several years before that. I think it's largely symptomatic of the larger points we pointed out earlier, which would be the confidence in the PLA and increasing change in the status quo kind of balance power there.
Well, another feature that wouldn't explain necessarily why it happened in October, but that may explain sort of the backstory here, is the changing U.S. position on the Taiwan question and on relations with China. So in some ways, very stable, of course. The U.S. still has a one China policy, still adheres to a variety of familiar foundational principles like the Taiwan Relations Act and the three communiques and so on. But we have seen Biden talk about the U.S. maintaining rock solid support for Taiwan, one of his early statements in office. And we've seen partly starting under Trump and continuing under Biden, building up of the Quad. We've seen the AUKUS, or however I'm pronouncing the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US submarine alignments. There are a lot of things where China looks around and sees, in its own words, kind of a plot of encirclement to keep China down. Do you think that underpins what's going on here? And how much do you think China sees this as a real shift versus an occasion to complain about something they don't much like?
No, I think that's all right. And I think we also need to all figure out how we're going to pronounce AUKUS or whatever at some point in the near future here, because I've heard at least 5 different ways. But no, I think that's all accurate. The increasing support for Taiwan within the United States is definitely going to agitate the PLA. At the same time, I think something that's going to, there's a little bit of back and forth here, right? It's going to agitate the PLA, but it's also going to help deter the PLA from taking unwanted actions at the same time. So how much can we kind of what's the word I'm looking for here? How much can we reconcile that, right? Where especially with a campaign that the PLA had explicitly stated, hey, we want to take Taiwan. And, like, I think that deterrence probably works a little more effectively for something of that dynamic as opposed to an unintended escalation from a different kind of dispute of sorts, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think it does, and I think we do sort of have a lot of very short-term swings. Like one of the things we haven't really talked about, and of course when we put this together, was when the flights were just happening, and of course it takes a few days to get these things on the air. In a way, it's kind of calmed down a little bit again, right? We saw Taiwan's National Day, the Republic of China's National Day, on October 10th. Pass by without a further uptick, which some had worried would happen. And Tsai gave a fairly forceful speech on sovereignty and democracy in Taiwan. And we've seen, in some ways, the real peak of friction in U.S.-China relationships, which we saw to some degree in the first Biden-Xi call and saw in the Alaska meetings in March, which were clearly quite contentious, and a bit of a climb down. I mean, the Zurich meeting and the scheduled Zoom summit that Biden and Xi will undertake before year's end if all goes well. Do you think this is going to be a relatively momentary blip? Are we on the path towards something a bit calmer?
Well, it's hard to say. Whenever you go over and you speculate on any of this, and it typically ends up being wrong in some way, right? So obviously, Taiwan's National Day, there was concern that we might see a similar blip. I am curious how much the Biden-Xi call went over and kind of affected that. But I think largely October 1st through the 4th, they got their message across that they were trying to go over and do. And we'll probably see more of a return towards the more systematic incursions that we saw. But there's a lot of different factors here. For instance, we saw a substantial downswing over the summer months, but that's also when you correlate that with weather patterns, right? The weather was really bad. So how much could they realistically fly into these things? And there's already, you have typhoon season and everything else. So there's a lot of weird correlating factors. I don't think that we'll go over and see a more lasting downswing I find that unlikely. I think that the ADIZ incursions are likely to increase, and particularly as the PLA does become more confident in its capacity to do that, I would imagine that there would be just a continual increase over the months or years going forward. But we'll have to see what happens, I suppose.
Okay. So once again, I want to encourage our viewers and listeners to put questions they have in the Q&A function. We got a couple more that I'll get to in due course, but do keep asking them as you have them. So I'm taking it from what we've been saying here, what I've seen you say in other contexts, that you're not of the school that an invasion is anything like imminent, that this is not a prelude to an invasion, and we're not, or for a military assault, whether or not it's a formal invasion by China on Taiwan, that's just not on the cards at the moment.
I would say it's not imminent, but I am not. I don't think that it's not, the potential is not there in the future, right? I don't think that the ADIZ incursions on their own are going to be like, oh, this means that a war is coming. I think it's symptomatic of the larger problem, but I also am not confident that the China and the PLA will not be confident and try to make a move. This challenge is time frame, right? And we don't know. I would rather go over and put a lot more of our eggs in the basket of preparing for a war in the case, hope that it doesn't happen and deterring this from occurring in the first place. I think that's the stronger move because there's a lot of uncertainty there. We do not know, right, when the PLA's reported time frame is. There's really no way to go over and ascertain that. What we do know for sure is that they are growing more capable of being able to achieve this goal, and I don't want them to have that capability.
Fair enough, and I think for now, there's still a fair amount to the position that this would be a hugely costly undertaking for China, not guaranteed of success, and even if successful, economically hugely costly, reputationally costly, at least still poses a significant risk of an escalating conflict with the United States. Not a great thing to do unless you feel like you really can and get away with it, or like you really need to because this is your last chance to keep Taiwan from slipping away, and neither one of those at least seems imminent. So if this is not for the purpose of preparing for a near-term invasion or really building up the sort of practice to do that, what do you see as the purposes of this ongoing set of undertakings? We talked about the operational elements that can help China prepare. We've talked about the attempt to point out to Taiwan that China will not tolerate certain drifts toward independence or certain ongoing rejection of unification. But beyond that, what else is in the mix here? I mean, deterring Taiwan again from going, well, let's take them one at a time. One is this question of deterring Taiwan from going farther down the path toward independence. Presumably not something Tsai Ing-wen is going to do. She's been quite moderate on that issue. She's done her best to say she will preserve stability and not reverse prior progress in cross-straits. But if that's the concern, what is exactly do you think China is trying to deter if we don't see Tsai as on the verge of doing something radical?
Well, I think that there are different views of what that means on both sides of the strait and in the U.S. The status quo is not really a defined status quo. Everybody interprets it differently, right? First off, obviously, Tsai Ing-wen could not unilaterally just declare independence, even if she wanted to, right? It's not how a democratic society works. So I think there's some misconceptions within a lot of viewers on that, Tsai is pro-independence and is just going to unilaterally declare that when, as you pointed out, she has done nothing of the sort. The stance of the Democratic Progressive Party has been that Taiwan is already independent and it is called the Republic of China, right? But there is definitely less of with the Chinese view in this, it's more towards that there won't be a move towards unification with the PRC, where this becomes less likely, right? And I think that's more towards what said signaling and concern is their view of, independence is primarily just the status quo where Taiwan already is independent in every way, shape, and form, except for, the international law kind of like recognition side of that. So it's a shift away from the potential that there will be some form of unification in the future.
Yeah, I think it's fair characterization. I mean, China has won on deterring formal independence, but has lost on encouraging unification or some such framework. And the question is, can it live with that status quo? probably seems, at least for now, although she has been pointed in stating that the issue cannot be put off generation to generation for the indefinite future. And then there is this nagging, although not imminent, concern that Taiwan will drift further away toward China's red lines on formal declarations. So to what extent do you think there is an attempt to deter other states in the region from getting too comfortable with the idea of supporting Taiwan? And we've seen moves by Japan. We've seen clearly by Japan in statements of stronger support for Taiwan. We've seen military deepening of cooperation, again with Australia, with the UK on some military practices in the area, Japan as well, which clearly have a Taiwan scenario in mind. So is China up to sort of saying to everybody in the region, hey, we're serious about this, don't get too cozy with the Americans on this agenda, sort of divide and conquer, if you will?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair characterization. I think that there's definitely a signaling component to at least some of such flights and maybe the greater trends in general, right? Where they do go over and try to signal their displeasure. Now, whether that means invasion is more or less likely, that's also harder to say. They could be displeased that Japan and the United States and other countries in the region are increasing their support and signal that displeasure. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're more likely to invade. In fact, it could be the opposite. They could be signaling this and trying to warn them, but this is the case of brinkmanship, right? Where they are actually less likely based on the greater costs that they would have to incur. As you pointed out, invading Taiwan is already incredibly challenging and incredibly costly. When the US was looking at taking Formosa in World War II, right, it planned on 150,000 casualties in the operation alone. And I think that in the age of modern warfare, where you have, anti-ship missiles and everything, like it very much favors the defender. The cost of such an operation to China with just Taiwan would already be immense. The economic cost from nations around, and then especially if someone like Japan and the United States were to get involved, as has potentially been signaled, then their costs are catastrophic. So just because China is increasing air defense identification zone incursions does not necessarily mean that they are more likely to invade. It could simply be this signal of displeasure on this kind of changing status quo, or it could, there are a lot of different ways you can potentially take this, right? There's no decided on definition here.
Right, that's right. I think if we don't think an invasion is really imminent and being plotted at this point, then everybody is playing to some degree a game of deterrence, trying to deter the other actors from doing things that it sees as imperiling its interests and at least tolerable status quo, or maybe some minor nudges from the status quo. So, China, Beijing is playing this game of trying to at least delay and weaken the joints in this alignment the U.S. is trying to build with regional states to deter China from acting toward Taiwan or on other territorial claims, and essentially trading on the longstanding view that regional states would rather not have to choose too clearly between China and the U.S. Well, there's been another piece of the fallout of some of the discussion, particularly in the U.S., over the significance and how to respond to the Chinese incursions into the ADIZ, which is it's reignited in at least a small form the chronic debate of should the U.S. in effect abandon Taiwan, right? So this argument that basically China is deeply committed to this issue, the U.S. isn't seriously prepared to go fight to defend Taiwan, so we should start drawing the lines now that says Taiwan isn't the kind of core interest to us that Japan and Korea are, whereas it is a core interest to China. Recognize the asymmetry of interest, recognize the growing or the movement toward a possible asymmetry of military capabilities, and just realize we're going to have to yield on that one. You've seen that debate in some of the policy media. What do you think of it, and do you think it's a blip or something that will become, if not a basis for really changing U.S. policy, at least the kind of chipping away at longstanding positions that we've seen recur from time to time? We can all go through the history of the Finlandization of Taiwan article in Foreign Affairs some time ago, the call to abandon Taiwan, and the sort of Charlie Glaser stuff. So where do you situate this one? Is this serious or not?
So there's definitely a robust debate on the topic and how much of a U.S. interest is defending Taiwan. I fall very, very, very clearly on that it is in the United States' interest to defend Taiwan. I think that that is a pretty clear piece based on a few different things, right? There is the geostrategic importance of Taiwan, based on like, you have sea lanes going through there. You have the challenge of like Chinese projection of aircraft sorties in the Philippine Sea, the potential implications for especially partners such as Japan, whereas, there's pieces of the Ryukyu Islands that are closer to Taiwan than they are to the mainland of Japan. Then just really, I mean, there's the inherent just value of democracy in itself, right? And supporting partners and allies within this region in order to allow this philosophy that we believe in to flourish, right? There's a lot of different ways to take it, right? I feel that, my opinion, going over and backing off of Taiwan and going over and kind of like ceding that interest would make eventual PRC occupation of Taiwan a reality, where I think it is something that can be deterred if we were to go over and put the investment and make clear that this is within our interests.
So there are all these big picture, long-term questions, but I want to narrow the frame again and talk about what could occur in the context of the re-escalation of to levels we saw in the past few days, or perhaps even something beyond that. And we saw a couple snippets in media reporting about some PLA Air Force pilot saying, "I felt so excited to be able to see the eyes of my enemy and it could be that close." And so, of course, the concern here is that we wouldn't get an intentional conflict, but that we could stumble into something, that we could get an incident that would escalate. And so we have a question in the chat from VOA reporter Tina Chung, who asks, some analysts are saying the PLA's increased exercises close to Taiwan. With that going on, risks of accident will only escalate. Taiwan's military might feel compelled to respond if PLA aircraft fly closer and closer to Taiwan, challenging, for example, Taiwan's control of the offshore islands like the Pratas by routinely flying nearby or even flying over Taiwan's main island, which Taiwan's military will be forced to take actions. So what are the possibilities that China could take a more provocative gray zone approach? And is there any significance to why Xi did not mention using force to unify Taiwan on his October 10th speech? So let's bracket that last question for now and focus on this risk of essentially inadvertent escalation if China starts doing more gray zone operations, starts going over the mainland of Taiwan, the main island of Taiwan, starts doing these things which have Taiwan jets not only scrambling, but perhaps feeling that Taiwan needs to push back more forcefully, or we simply get an accident. Which those of us old enough to remember the EP3 incident know that kind of thing can happen.
No, I think that's exactly right. There are chances for accident or like unintentional escalation stemming from these kind of gray zone encroaches. It does increase substantially, and as China goes over and starts doing the thing more and more and gets closer and closer to Taiwanese airspace, then there's a lot of cause for concern there. Things can definitely spiral out of hand very, very easily. One thing that I've seen mentioned is there's contention on like, okay, well, how does Taiwan actually define its airspace? Withdrawing straight baselines from the surrounding islands and things along those lines. The PLA could challenge that definition, right? How does Taiwan respond to that? How did and that's a question that I don't know, and hopefully I will never have to know. But there's definitely cause for concern of something escalating out of control there and a conflict starting unintentionally based on that.
And as Danny Russell, former Assistant Secretary of State, said, there's very little insulation left on the wiring of U.S. PRC relations. So anything that happens in the Taiwan region could be bad news for broader U.S.-China relations, which are already, as Russell says, quite fraught. And, to try to put it pithily, Taiwan is the most likely source of a great power real conflict, military conflict in the world today, but there are no really likely sources of great power military conflict in the near term, at least. So something to worry about, but not to treat as inevitably oncoming. So I want to get another question or two in the chat before we turn to another topic here. So let's take up the last part of Tina Chung's question, which is it significant that Xi Jinping did not mention using force to reunify or unify Taiwan in his National Day speech?
I find it challenging to go over and discern how much significance is in every speech where it mentions or does not mention. I think that in general, like General Secretary Xi does not always mention that. He also has or explicitly mentioned it in other times, right? That could be product of the Biden-Xi discussion that happened previously after the incursions. I'm not sure. So the best answer to that question is I do not know. I am reading less into the one speech and more into the general trends over time of PLA modernization and the general decline in cross-strait relations.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't think we can read too much into individual choices of words. That they're, we used to say that whenever any American leader or senior official would say something that got a little bit off of past script, and you saw this with George W. Bush, you saw this with Colin Powell, you saw it with Clinton, you saw it with Obama. Every once in a while, somebody would say something that wasn't quite the catechism, and then you would see people scramble back to say, no, there's been no change in policy. Well, that kind of exchange doesn't happen openly in Chinese discourse, and I think it's probably a bit more planned. Things are a bit more carefully scripted, but there's a real stability to the underlying position, which is China's preference is peaceful unification. It's not in a big hurry, but it's got to happen eventually, and the use of force is always claimed to be a potential if Taiwan goes the wrong way. So there will be these momentary, I think, either explicit or more often implicit tit-for-tat deals, and so it may have something to do with the attempt to take down the temperature in U.S.-China relations. And I don't know how to read Xi's omission. I don't know how to read Biden's strange reference to agreed to abide by the Taiwan Agreement, whatever that is, which we take it as a somewhat awkward reference to the idea that the Taiwan Relations Act and other elements of U.S.-China policy remain intact. So another question in the chat about a somewhat collateral issue, but certainly part of the cross-strait question, which is China and Taiwan are both seeking CPTPP entry. Taiwan more explicitly and immediately, but China certainly has moved in that direction. Do you think this will substantiate the notion that Beijing would pursue a larger bloc, building on the Trans-Pacific political bloc, and to deter Taiwan at any feasible scenario? I'm not quite sure how to unpack the last bit of that. But China has not been exactly terribly welcoming for Taiwan joining a variety of organizations. The last really major entity that Taiwan got into as a full member was the WTO, and that was part of a deal for China's entry. And Taiwan's access to things like the World Health Assembly and some dealings with the WHO have been not exactly with Chinese support, but Chinese acquiescence, partly because of a lot of criticism of Chinese behavior. So what would it mean if Taiwan, how would we read the signal if Taiwan got into the CPTPP? And what would China do faced with the prospect of joint membership? Does that become, if they both get in, does that become another lever for Taiwan for China against Taiwan, or does it give Taiwan a little more security in its regional space?
Ooh, that's a hard question. Obviously, like you pointed out, any time that international organizations, agreements treat Taiwan like the state that it is, it angers China, and it causes further complications within that relationship. There's usually some kind, and China actively seeks to prevent Taiwan from having any meaningful contribution or access to international organizations generally, especially under the Democratic Progressive Party administration. The CPTPP question, I will be very curious to see where that goes. If both Taiwan and China were admitted to that, I don't really know how that would turn out, and I'm just I would be very interesting to see the way that unfolds, but I don't think I have a great answer for that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a tough one, and of course, what makes it an interesting and difficult question is the U.S. having opted out of the TPP and making it the CPTPP. I mean, it was the economic leg of the pivot to Asia, and the U.S. To strain the metaphor, chopping off its own leg, has not exactly made us a nimble sprinter for trying to provide what in Asia is always important, the economic underpinnings for a kind of security alignment. So that's to some degree a problem of our own making, and as your response points out, how to read what China and Taiwan do in that space is made complicated and is made a matter of concern and impact because the U.S. is not the biggest economy in that CPTPP, which it did have the opportunity. to have the opportunity to be. So one of the questions that showed up in the chat that we definitely want to turn to before we reach the end of our time here is what the U.S. should be doing. This is, as I think we said, largely a question about deterring China, primarily deterring China from being more coercive toward Taiwan, whether that's escalating further into the gray zone in the hopes of intimidating Taiwan or depressing Taiwan into a degree of acquiescence, or whether it is actually pursuing or at least risking inadvertently a conflict. Clearly, the U.S. goal is to deter a certain range of activities. And China's goal is the minimum to deter Taiwan from doing certain things, but hopefully to coerce it into undertaking certain things. So what should we do? What should U.S. policy be and what changes perhaps should U.S. policy undertake to cope with these things? We've seen a few silly things. There was an op-ed by a member of Congress in the Washington Post today about how we need to amend the Taiwan Relations Act because the president has no authority to take military action in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, absent going through the War Powers Act process with Congress, something which has never been used, and the lack of which has never deterred a U.S. president from dispatching troops if he or she deems it in the national interest. So that one's kind of silly. But more seriously, you've seen things like a call to abandon strategic ambiguity for strategic clarity and other measures. So if you have the ear of those grappling with how to think about Taiwan and U.S. cross-straits policy in light of some longer-term developments, particularly in light of the concerns raised by the recent events, the post-October 1 sorties and so on. What kind of adjustments do you think are necessary? And how much can we sort of stand pat with what we've been doing for a long time?
Yeah, no, it's a great set of questions. So you pointed the strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity debate. I think there's a wide and rich discussion amongst a lot of very, very smart people about which way the U.S. should go. I tend to side with the position of strategic clarity. I think that in a campaign where the PRC has made it explicit what it will eventually try to do in the case that it cannot peacefully unify with Taiwan. I think that the more effective measure there is to make clear U.S. commitment and deter any such things from happening. But at the same time, I don't think that ambiguity versus clarity is the most important facet of this discussion. I think a lot more of it has to do with operational capacity with both the U.S. and Taiwan. So one thing that's been highlighted a little bit on this is the operational wear to Taiwan's Air Force from engaging in Taiwan. They stopped going over and responding to every sortie several months back, but they're especially larger sorties, like, there's definitely a reason that they stopped doing that. It is a large amount of wear on their Air Force, where the last study that I saw from Shar School went over and highlighted that 13% of Taiwan's defense budget goes towards its fighter jet force, which is a relatively unsurvivable force. Another study from RAND showed about 360 SRBMs and 5 Su-30 sorties could pretty much eliminate the entire standing Air Force that for fighter jet aircraft that Taiwan has. So is that really the most survivable aspect of its platform? And I think that's where things like the overall defense concept that Taiwan put forward a few years ago really show a lot of promise into making a lot more survivable dispersible systems that can conduct asymmetric damage that may not be able to make Taiwan win an all-out conflict with China, but can then help deny China the capacity to take Taiwan if it decides that is the option it wants to take and substantially raise the cost. With the United States, I think that you need a lot further investments in the region and to go over and really increase partnerships, right? Stronger discussions with Taiwan and signaling in that regard. I think the U.S.-Japanese partnerships and discussions that have happened recently have been a huge step towards ensuring that. I know Defense Minister and the Secretary of Defense Austin went over and both stated to cooperate in the event of a crisis in Taiwan Strait, and I think things like that are a great move. It just needs to be partnered with investment in the region and ensuring that the United States has the operational capacity to work alongside allies and partners in the case of hostilities ever occurred, and by virtue of that, prevent that from happening in the first place.
And I think it's an important point that Tsai Ing-wen has gotten a fair amount of credit for emphasizing Taiwan's defense needs and investing in defense, but it's not just a dollar amount, kind of like we talk about the Build Back Better plan. It's not just a dollar amount, it's about the actual details in it and this sense of getting survivable forces and asymmetric capabilities has been an important part of that story. So as long as we're kind of in the hardware end of things, that is actual capabilities in various scenarios, we have one question in the chat that asks if you've seen indications of significant increases or shifts in force mobility across other warfighting domains, that is marine, subsurface, marine surface, subsurface, basically other military capabilities, not the Air Force, or I guess ballistic missiles will be part of this too. But has China gained relevant capability across the board in a way that is changing the cross-strait equation that we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's entirely correct that they have. So there's been a large focus on those sea and airlift capabilities to go over and pull troops across the strait in the case that it decides to engage in hostilities there. I know Thomas Shugart as well recently put out a paper evaluating civilian craft and the capability to commission those for use in sea lift capabilities and a cross-strait contingency, which would vastly, while obviously less survivable than a military craft, would greatly improve the amount of troops that the PLA could ferry across the strait. There's been, just in general, PLA modernization over the last 2 decades especially has been moving at breakneck speeds. And I think especially with the reorganization in 2015 into joint theater commands that help ensure that, gear the PLA towards a maritime conflict within its local waters and more joint force, more of a joint force composition that can work better with each other. And you've seen this was changes in the Central Military Commission's leadership, where you have more of a divergence away from the traditional like PLA Army dominance of the PLA and more towards Navy and Air Force components. So really across the spectrum of PLA modernization, they are becoming far more capable and prepared to engage in hostilities over Taiwan if they deem it necessary.
So that's in terms of the cross-strait capabilities in a fairly concrete and detailed way. One of the things that's gotten a lot of press in the context of the recent events also is that there have been some tabletop war games conducted by the United States, the blue team, red team games, in which the blue team hasn't done so well sometimes. That is, there are at least some scenarios where the U.S. is unable to ride to Taiwan's rescue and may actually lose a localized conflict in the area. How seriously should we take that, especially given that these games are designed sort of as stress tests, right? They're designed to test the bad case scenarios. So how much should that change our thinking?
I think that your last point there is the important one to stress here, right? War games are not necessarily designed to be the all-encompassing predictive force, right? They are designed as stress tests. They are going over and putting pressure on weaknesses within the region, and I would be more alarmed if we were winning every war game, because I think that would be disingenuous. I don't think that people cite war games as like, oh, we can't succeed in this endeavor. I don't think that that's really the most accurate way to portray it, as opposed to a tool that goes over and helps leaders evaluate what decisions we should be doing, where we should be investing funds, and stressing where our weaknesses are in that regard.
Okay, we have another question in the chat, and I suspect that you're of the school that diversionary wars are extremely unlikely. But are diversionary events like shows of military force through these kinds of flybys to rattle Taiwan, do those occur? Or as the questioner puts it, is it possible that the ADIZ incursions are being used to divert domestic Chinese audiences from their developing problems such as internal debt, social economic crises, basically a dramatic way of playing the nationalism card?
I'd say it's a possibility in a sense. I don't necessarily think that war on its own would go over and occur by those means. I don't think it's impossible by any means. I know a friend and colleague of mine, Mike Mazza, has a lot of kind of interesting work touching on that possibility. But especially as something like ADIZ incursions, I think that was specifically the ones that we're referring to here, October 1st through the 4th, a massive show of force in that way. And then you saw, Hu Shijun and the Global Times stoking that same kind of nationalist, ego there, and just discussing how, China's Nationals Day parade was in the Taiwan Strait, and there's a lot of stoking that kind of nationalism card for sure going on, and potentially you could see something along those lines to divert from problems at home. I find it a lot less likely that a entire conflict would occur on those realm, but I wouldn't put it outside the realm of possibility as well. But that's hard to assess accurately.
So I want to return in our closing minutes here to some of the issues that we didn't fully nail down about what the U.S. should be doing to achieve its goals of what are still goals of dual deterrence, but the deterrence right now is deterring China from coercion, not deterring Taiwan from Chen Shui-bian era style moves that would provoke a crisis, and how to do so if we keep the policy of strategic ambiguity in place or stretch it a little bit. And to some extent, that's a little bit playing with words. I think announcing a change from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity would be seen as symbolically huge, but under either concept, you've got a range of things you can do. And there's been an aspect of strategic ambiguity. It's always been pretty clear, which is the U.S. sits in judgment of what's going on and decides who the bad guy is. And leans on them. So clearly the current issue is to deter China from action. And of course, the critique of strategic clarity is then you wind up drawing red lines and then you have to figure out whether you stick with them or not. I think that's a little disingenuous too, because strategic clarity doesn't mean setting out a list of conditions that will trigger U.S. intervention and which ones won't. So there's flexibility on either side of that fence, and much of the question really is, do you symbolically cross the fence? So that, with that preamble in place, what in a relatively detailed way should the U.S. be doing? You said that you have some leanings toward going with strategic clarity, whatever that may mean, but I suggested we've got to unpack whether that's any more definitive than strategic ambiguity. But what do we do to be, whatever policy rubric we put it under, what should be doing to make our deterrent credible in an era when we at least have reason to worry that China may be overly self-confident in its own abilities or in the U.S.'s lack of commitment to ride to the rescue in certain scenarios? What can we do to bring the message home to Beijing so that we hopefully continue in a state of at least adequate deterrence rather than risking a misperception that leads to conflict?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good characterization. With strategic ambiguity versus clarity, it's very convenient to put it into two neatly sorted bins like that, but I don't think it's anywhere near that simple, as you pointed out. There's a lot of in between and differences in like what either of those policies could be like, and there's a lot of overlap there too. I think that the things that are more clear is that the United States should go over and increase its support for Taiwan and increase interactions with Taiwanese officials within that manner, and especially with allies in the region as well, on joint planning for the instance that something does occur, and increase basically like preparing for moving more funds towards US Indo-PACOM, and really increasing kind of a military focus on being able to engage in that region should the worst come to pass, which I hope that by going over and preparing for said contingencies, then you can go over and prevent it from occurring in the first place. But really, I think that there's a large part of just strengthening partnerships and slowly increasing our interactions with Taiwan, with Taiwanese officials. And I think that the current, a lot of the legislation passed in Congress recently over the last several years has been a strong step towards this. And there's always been a lot of really strong bipartisan support for Taiwan and the legislative branch, which goes back all the way to the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, right? I don't think that's really ever abated, and I think kind of continuing down that path and increasing ties within this manner is a strong move for the United States, and will help go over and support preventing China from making any such moves, and while increasing our relationship with our partners in Taiwan.
So Gerald's taken you from the sort of military and hardware defense set of issues into alliance and quasi-alliance diplomacy and some of its foundations in the U.S. Political discourse. I agree with all that, and so I'll close by going even farther toward the squishy end of what we might do. And I think there is an international rhetorical component to this as well. And one of the striking things that Tsai Ing-wen did in her National Day speech and did in the Foreign Affairs article that just came out is to make the case that regional peace and security, and implicitly U.S. interests, security interests in the region, are linked to this question of defending democracies against pressure from authoritarian regimes that not only would in a quite direct way threaten Taiwan's democracy, but that would be a step toward undermining a liberal rules-based international order that has served the U.S. and many of its friends in the region pretty well. So I think Tsai has played that card cleverly, and I think it speaks to foreign policy principles the Biden administration has embraced, saying it's not a values security trade-off. They actually are mutually reinforcing. That's hardly new, but it's back, I think, more at the center of American foreign policy, certainly than it has been in years gone by. And I think it's a matter also of not acquiescing in China's narrative that this is an internal affair, that this is a core interest of China and a secondary or peripheral interest at best of the United States. I think that's a dangerous message if you want to be credibly deterring, and if you buy the argument we were just talking about, it's also an incorrect one. Descriptively, there's a lot of interesting polling about whether Americans, not just sort of Congress and politically leaders, whether Americans support the idea of backing Taiwan in a conflict, and those numbers have ticked up. I don't know how much you can make of that. The Chicago Council on World Affairs survey that said it hit 50%. I mean, I'm skeptical about how meaningful it is. I think there's a lot of room for political leadership in either direction with those numbers, but it may well reflect more about U.S. views of China than it does U.S. views of the Cross-Strait situation. But it's worth keeping in mind, and I think playing those things up to those audiences in China that are doubtful or deeply skeptical of the level of U.S. commitment, because I think it's really everybody's better off if we don't get conflict or risk of conflict in the Strait. Well, I want to thank Gerald Brown for joining us today. Terrific conversation. I want to thank the 50-some of you who've been on our call throughout. Thank you for joining us. Again, these programs are free to you, but they're not entirely free to us, so please consider joining FPRI. You can do that on our website at fpri.org. We'll have more events coming up in the near future on Taiwan and other East Asia-related topics, and as you can see from today, we get some terrific guests to join us, so please come back and see us next time. Thank you.